He walked in just 12 minutes late. That's all it took for a black president from Africa, not a criminal, not a protester, but a respected world leader, to be publicly humiliated, fined $500, and threatened with jail by Judge Douglas Whitaker, a white American judge with a reputation for humiliating young defendants and abusing his power behind closed doors. And in the days that followed, Traoré didn't just speak out. He launched an investigation, gathered evidence, and exposed 42 young black men who had been wrongfully sentenced by this very judge. Many of them for doing nothing more than speaking out in court. And he made public the shocking truths of this judge that made everyone present at the trial that day burst into tears. So what exactly did Traoré reveal that could make the powerful judge bow his head and repent before the court? And how was he able to collect evidence that the judge had previously tried to bury? It all started with a traffic ticket, just a routine bureaucratic error that somehow tagged the name of Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, to a parking violation in the city of Dallas, Texas. A minor mishap, easily fixable with a few phone calls or a signed affidavit. But Ibrahim, ever the statesman, even in moments of personal inconvenience, insisted on handling it himself. Sitting in the back seat of a modest black sedan, dressed in a simple navy blue suit with no presidential insignia, he looked more like a traveling professor than a head of state. His communications director, Malakanda, sat beside him, visibly anxious. "Mr. President," she said, waving a stack of printed court documents in front of him, "you really don't have to go in for this. We can have legal counsel take care of it remotely." Ibrahim leaned back with a faint smile. "Malika, I tell my people every day that the law matters. What message would I send if I treated myself differently, especially when I'm far from home?" She rolled her eyes, muttering, "It's a traffic ticket, not an indictment." He laughed, rubbing his forehead. "What's the worst they can do? Fine me." As the car pulled onto Commerce Street, just 2 blocks from the courthouse, Ibrahim's phone buzzed with an alert marked, "High Priority." He glanced down. It was a secure message from the African Union. Classified details involving a whistleblower who had exposed disturbing abuse in a detention facility in northern Nigeria. Traoré immediately instructed the driver to pull over. He stepped out of the vehicle and spent nearly 20 tense minutes leaning against a brick wall in the rising Texas heat, speaking softly in French and English, his voice calm but resolute. Children had been placed in solitary confinement. Medical care was being withheld. Blood on sheets. Crying behind concrete walls. When the call ended, he stood still for a moment, letting the weight of the information settle on his chest. Then he looked at his watch, 9:22 a.m. The hearing had been scheduled for 9:15. He climbed back into the car without a word, and they proceeded toward the courthouse. He was now 12 minutes late. Inside courtroom 4B, the air was still and unforgiving. The room was known among locals as Whitaker's Trap, a place where even minor mistakes led to major consequences. The ceilings were low, the lighting harsh. The judge's bench, positioned like a throne at the far end of the room, cast long shadows over the heads of the nervous defendants waiting for their names to be called. Seated on wooden benches were a few public defenders, some community reporters with notepads ready, and 2 college students who had come to watch the infamous Judge Douglas Whitaker in action. The judge, an aging white man with thinning silver hair, cold blue eyes, and a permanent scowl etched into his face, had a reputation for delivering harsh rulings, especially toward younger and non-white defendants. And he thrived on order, punctuality, and absolute obedience. When the doors finally opened at 9:27, the sound of polished leather shoes echoed through the chamber like a metronome of rising tension. Ibrahim walked in calmly, carrying no briefcase, flanked by no bodyguards, accompanied only by Malika, who quietly slipped into a bench near the back. He approached the front with quiet dignity, his hands clasped behind his back. Before he could speak, before he could even offer an apology, Whitaker was already leaning forward. 12 minutes late, the judge said, eyes narrow and voice dripping with disdain. "Must be nice to stroll in on your own schedule, Mr. President." The words hung in the air, not with the curiosity of a man seeking answers, but with the venom of a man seeking submission. Ibrahim kept his composure. "Your Honor, I apologize for the delay. I was pulled into a..." Whitaker didn't let him finish. He raised the gavel and struck the block. Crack. "Contempt of court. $500 fine. Payable today, or you'll be escorted out." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Malika's hand flew to her mouth. Even the bailiff looked momentarily stunned. The president of Burkina Faso, standing in an American courtroom over a bureaucratic error, had just been publicly fined and threatened with jail by a local judge without so much as a chance to speak. Ibrahim didn't blink. His jaw tightened, but his posture didn't change. He simply nodded once, respectfully, then returned to his seat. Not because he accepted the insult, but because he understood the stage he was now on. This wasn't about him anymore. This was about the system that had just told a black president, "You're still just another body in my courtroom." The silence after the gavel was thicker than the sound itself. Reporters scribbled furiously. One leaned over and whispered, "Did that just happen?" It had. And what no one knew at that moment, not the judge, not the clerks, not even the aides, was that Ibrahim Traoré had just decided to fight back. Not with anger, not with shouting, but with facts, with law, and with something more dangerous than rage, the truth. This courtroom had been Whitaker's domain for decades. But in 12 short minutes, something had shifted. And as Traoré calmly reached for his phone and began typing a message to his legal team, one thing became absolutely certain: this was far from over. Long before Ibrahim Traoré ever stepped foot into that Dallas courtroom, the question had been asked again and again by those closest to him, "Why are you going yourself?" It wasn't as if the president of Burkina Faso lacked channels of influence or legal surrogates. A phone call to the embassy could have resolved the clerical error in minutes. But when his aide Malikika asked him one last time before they left the hotel that morning, Traoré had looked up from the newspaper in his lap and smiled softly. "Because if I want my people to believe in justice," he said, "I have to show them I live under it too." The words came simply, without performance. He wasn't trying to be noble. He was simply being who he had always been, a man who believed in the weight of example. On the way to the courthouse, he had waved through the car window at sanitation workers sweeping the sidewalks and construction workers on scaffolding who barely glanced at the man passing by in a diplomatic vehicle. Once they arrived, Traoré stepped out alone, buttoning his jacket, and instead of walking up the VIP ramp meant for public officials, he chose to wait in line with civilians. A security guard did a double take, clearly recognizing him but unsure if he should say anything. Ibrahim simply nodded politely and continued standing in line. He even joked with a janitor near the metal detectors, asking if he'd ever been fined for accidentally dropping his mop in the wrong hallway. The janitor chuckled and said, "Nah, but I wouldn't put it past Judge Whitaker." A few people in line overheard and laughed. The mood was warm, even light. Ibrahim took the opportunity to ask a young man beside him what he was in for. "Missed summons," the man replied. "They say that's contempt now." "First offense, we'll see." Ibrahim raised an eyebrow. Harsh for a slip of memory. The man shrugged. "Not in this court." Inside, that warmth quickly faded, and with each passing second, the reasons for Ibrahim's presence, the symbolic importance of standing in that courtroom as a man of law and principle, began to warp under the weight of what he was witnessing. It started with a murmur, faint, almost dismissible, but unmistakable. As Ibrahim sat quietly on the courtroom bench after the gavel had delivered its blow, he began to notice the small reactions around him. Two women seated behind him whispered, their eyes fixed on Judge Whitaker with clear discomfort. "He does this all the time," one muttered. "Especially if they walk in late," the other added. "Or if they talk back. Doesn't matter who you are, he'll make an example out of you." Ibrahim didn't turn around, he just listened. A few rows to the left, a young black man no older than 20 leaned close to his mother and whispered something that made Ibrahim's shoulders stiffen. "That's the same judge who gave me 30 days for talking back," the boy said. "Just for saying I didn't understand his order." His mother clenched her purse tighter. "Don't say anything today," she whispered back. "Not even if it's unfair. Just keep quiet." Ibrahim slowly scanned the room. There was no outrage, no gasps of disbelief, just a quiet, almost ritualistic acceptance. The defendants were mostly young, mostly black or Latino. Their lawyers looked weary. Some of them barely raised objections when Whitaker interrupted or belittled them. The fear in the room wasn't theatrical. It was institutional. It was learned behavior. And suddenly, Ibrahim understood something devastating. This courtroom wasn't a temple of justice. It was a machine. A cold, humming machine that punished people before it ever heard them speak. This wasn't about him. It never had been. The contempt charge, the $500 fine, the judge's clipped sarcasm, those were just symptoms. The disease was older, deeper, and far more insidious. It was built into the wood panels and legal precedents. It wore a robe and held a gavel, but it wielded neither fairness nor dignity. As Ibrahim sat there, watching a teenager be dismissed without a hearing and another man penalized for disrespecting the court by asking to clarify his plea, a chilling truth settled over him like frost: this courtroom wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as it was designed to. And now Ibrahim Traoré realized, with quiet certainty, he hadn't walked into a courtroom. He had walked straight into a battlefield. Sitting silently on the courtroom bench, Ibrahim Traoré allowed his mind to wander back across oceans and years to a moment that now felt impossibly distant. It was decades ago in Burkina Faso, long before he became president, when he was just a young military cadet barely out of school. He had been ordered to attend a hearing at a small regional military court as part of his legal training. The judge presiding that day was an elderly man named Justice Kabor, known across the region not for his power, but for his humility. Traoré had sat in the back, green uniform too big for his shoulders, watching with fascination as a weathered farmer was brought before the court. The man had been caught transporting crops through restricted military land, a technical offense punishable by a fine or short-term detention. When asked why he had trespassed, the farmer replied simply, "Because my family was hungry, and the long road would have cost us the grain." There was no anger in his voice, just exhaustion. Justice Kabor stared at the man for a long moment, then removed his glasses. "Sir," he said, "your crime is being poor and barefoot." The courtroom chuckled quietly. Even the prosecutor smirked. Then the judge leaned back and delivered his verdict: no fine, no jail time, just a warning. And with a wink to the guards, he ordered someone to bring the man a loaf of bread from the courthouse kitchen. The farmer left confused but grateful. Traoré remembered being stunned, not by the mercy, but by the quiet authority behind it. That judge, he'd later tell his fellow cadets over dinner, gave that man a lecture in a loaf of bread. They all laughed. One of them joked, "Only in Burkina Faso do you leave court with a criminal record and lunch." It was a simpler time, but it taught him something no textbook ever had: justice, when tempered with compassion, could nourish more than it punished. Now, sitting in courtroom 4B, that memory felt like a story from another world. Here in Dallas, there were no judges offering lectures and loaves of bread. Only silence, iron rules, and eyes that dared not meet the bench. Ibrahim glanced across the room and spotted a boy, 16, maybe 17, sitting behind the reinforced glass near the holding area. His wrists were cuffed, ankles shackled, the oversized jumpsuit bunching around his thin frame. He wasn't crying. He wasn't speaking. He was just staring, at the floor, at the guards, occasionally at the door, but mostly at nothing. It was a look Ibrahim recognized. Not fear, exactly, but something deeper: resignation. The quiet internal collapse that comes when you realize you are not being seen, not being heard, and certainly not being helped. The bailiff called another name, and the boy flinched, but it wasn't his turn. The judge was moving swiftly through cases now, dismissing pleas, denying motions, sentencing people before their lawyers finished speaking. Next. Denied. 30 days. The words were delivered like factory stamps, cold and unfeeling. As the courtroom buzzed in low murmurs and paperwork shuffled from bench to desk, Ibrahim kept his eyes on the boy. He turned slightly to Malikika and whispered, "He's not on trial." She looked at him, confused. He didn't blink. "He's just next." That sentence, those 4 words, held the weight of generations. The boy's eyes met Ibrahim's for a moment. And in that single, aching glance, something passed between them. Not recognition of power, not gratitude, just an unspoken, shared understanding: you see me. And in a place like this, that was everything. Ibrahim Traoré, once a young cadet who had watched mercy handed out with bread, now sat in a courtroom where justice was a weapon and silence was the law's most loyal servant. The contrast was unbearable. And for the first time since the gavel fell, his eyes welled with tears. Not for himself, not even for the insult, but for that boy behind the glass. A boy who wouldn't get a lecture or a loaf of bread. A boy who wouldn't even get a chance. 2 hours after leaving the courtroom, Ibrahim Traoré's Dallas hotel suite had been transformed into something resembling a tactical operations center. The coffee table was buried under legal pads, USB drives, and folders with handwritten tabs sticking out at every angle. A dozen court transcripts sat in one corner like unread scripture, and 3 laptops hummed on the couch, each manned by someone typing furiously. The television in the background played muted cable news clips of the courtroom footage, grainy, shaky, but already spreading across state outlets. Traoré sat cross-legged at the edge of a dining chair, sleeves rolled up, phone in one hand and a highlighter in the other. His face was calm, but his eyes burned with focus. "This courthouse gave me a $500 fine," he muttered dryly, eyes scanning a sentencing report. "Let's see what it owes everyone else." That line drew laughter from the room. Malikika, perched on the armrest nearby, chuckled as she sipped lukewarm coffee. "You're about to make them wish it was just a fine," she said. Even Dr. Felix Wadrago, the most serious of the group and a data analyst by trade, allowed himself a smirk. "Ibrahim, are we investigating a judge or waging digital war?" Traoré didn't look up. "Both. But only one of us is losing sleep." The team worked like they had in his early days of resistance. No press releases, no grandstanding, just raw information, silent urgency, and a quiet understanding that something larger than them had begun. There was no need for pep talks. Everyone in the room knew what they were doing, not responding to an insult, but tearing down a wall that had stood for too long. By midnight, Felix had found it. He stood abruptly from the laptop, his expression blank, almost clinical. "I found the pattern," he said, holding up a printed docket list like it was a verdict. The room stilled. Over the past 5 years, Judge Whitaker has issued contempt charges against 42 young black men, nearly all under the age of 25. He paused, then added, and in over 60% of those cases, the contempt wasn't for disruption or violence. It was for things like, he flipped through the papers, scanning, refusing to stand fast enough, asking for clarification, and he blinked, reading one aloud, eye-rolling. The room went silent. Malikika slowly lowered her coffee cup, suddenly nauseated. Ibrahim took the papers, scanning them line by line. 19 years old, he read, sentenced to 10 days for saying, "Sir, I don't understand." Another one got 15 days for asking if he could call his mother. His hand trembled slightly as he turned the page. This one, 30 days. Charge, visible eye rolling in response to sentence. His voice lowered to a whisper. He didn't go to jail for committing a crime. He went to jail for being seen. Felix nodded grimly. They weren't punished for what they did, he said. They were punished for existing, young, black, and unafraid to show confusion or doubt. Ibrahim stared at the list, then back at the grainy footage now replaying on the TV, Judge Whitaker slamming the gavel, face tight with disdain, ruling like a man who had never once been questioned. The weight of the pages was nothing, but what they represented could shake the very bench they were typed for. "We're not just dealing with bias," Ibrahim said softly. "We're dealing with calculated suppression, and it's been happening in silence." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. In that moment, everyone in the room understood, they were no longer just documenting a pattern. They were preparing to bring it down, brick by brick, sentence by sentence. Because if this evidence saw daylight, Judge Whitaker's courtroom wouldn't just be under scrutiny. It would never be the same again. The room was silent except for the soft hum of an air conditioning unit and the occasional scratch of a pen. They had chosen a neutral meeting spot, a small community legal center 2 blocks from the courthouse, dimly lit and sparsely decorated. The fluorescent lights flickered faintly above as Naomi Taylor, a former courtroom clerk, sat across from Ibrahim Traoré. She looked smaller in person than she had in the staff directory photo, her fingers curled tightly around the edge of her handbag. At first, she struggled to speak, her lips opening twice, then closing again. But Ibrahim didn't rush her. He just nodded once, as if to say, "Take your time. We're listening." When Naomi finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "He used to call them animals," she said. Not even quietly, right in chambers, with the door half open. Said things like, "They need cages, not courts." Her hands trembled as she continued. One time, a mother wrote in. She said her son was mentally ill. Begged for compassion in sentencing. He told me to shred it. Said he didn't take notes from sob stories. There was a pause, heavy and bitter. Malikika swallowed hard. Felix looked away, jaw clenched. Naomi wiped the corner of her eye, but her voice grew firmer. "I wanted to quit so many times. I thought I was the only one who felt it. Like the courtroom wasn't about the law anymore. It was about control, humiliation, especially if you were young or black or poor. I saw motions dismissed without being read. I saw defendants punished for tone, for posture, for just existing." She glanced down, then back up. "I'm sorry I didn't speak out sooner." Ibrahim leaned forward, his voice soft but resolute. "You're speaking now. That's what matters. The silence is already breaking." She looked at him, and something shifted in her face. Not relief, not absolution, but the beginning of courage. Later that night, back in the hotel suite, Ibrahim sat at the edge of the table scrolling through case files when his phone buzzed. A message appeared on the secure channel he used only for whistleblower contact. It was short, anonymous. Just a first name and a sentence, "You're not wrong. I have the records." His pulse quickened. Malikika leaned in. "Who is it?" He turned the screen so she could see. The contact ID was unknown, but the implications were immediate. "Someone on the inside," he said. "A current staffer." The words sent a ripple through the room. Felix pushed aside the pile of transcripts and opened a fresh notepad. "If they're still working in Whitaker's court," he said slowly, "they could have access to internal memos, draft rulings, even shredded case logs." Malikika looked between them. "And if that's true, then Naomi is not alone." The realization hit all at once: there were others. More clerks, more assistants, people who had spent years caught in the machinery of that courtroom, forced to serve a system they silently resented. They had never spoken because they believed no one would listen. But now someone had listened, and more importantly, someone had stood up. Ibrahim reread the message slowly, the words vibrating with quiet urgency. He didn't know who this person was, but they had just cracked open the dam. For years, people thought Whitaker's courtroom was just cruel. Now it was clear it had been corrupt, built not on oversight, but on intimidation and secrecy. But the secret was out. The silence wasn't just ending. It was unraveling. What began with one brave voice had now become a chorus. The system wasn't just broken. It was breaking open. And with every whispered truth, the light got a little closer. 3 days after his own hearing, Ibrahim Traoré returned to courtroom 4B. Not as a defendant, not with cameras trailing him, not even with his full staff. He walked in quietly, a neutral suit replacing the sharp navy blazer from before, and took a seat near the back row with nothing but a slim notepad in his hand and a pen tucked into the inside pocket of his coat. No entourage, no announcement, just presence. The courtroom was half full, its usual mix of overworked public defenders and nervous young defendants slumped beside them, waiting for the next name to be called. Only a few people noticed him at first. An older woman in the gallery did a double-take, elbowed her daughter, and whispered something inaudible. But it was when Judge Whitaker entered from his private door and scanned the room that the temperature changed. His eyes found Traoré in less than 5 seconds. For a moment, he paused. The smirk he wore so routinely was gone. There was no contempt charge to issue this time, no technicality to seize, just the undeniable reality that the man he had mocked days earlier was back and watching. Whitaker cleared his throat and called the court to order with the same gavel he had slammed so eagerly just days before. But now every word he uttered felt measured, rehearsed, as if he knew the script had changed and the audience had shifted. And Traoré, calm, composed, did not blink. He did not speak. He simply watched, his pen occasionally sliding across the paper as the cases rolled forward, one after another, each one now carrying the added weight of his gaze. There were no cameras inside, but everyone in that room knew something had changed. The man in the back row wasn't just observing. He was building something. About 40 minutes into the session, a name was called that seemed to momentarily disrupt the flow: David Samicki. He was 22, tall, with a nervous shuffle and soft brown eyes that darted between the floor and the judge's bench. It was his first offense, disorderly conduct, a charge so vague even the public defender looked unsure how to defend it. David stood beside his attorney and cleared his throat, his voice shaking but honest. "Sir, I didn't even." But he didn't get to finish. Judge Whitaker's voice boomed over him like thunder cracking through dry air. "One more word out of you, and you'll find yourself in contempt." David blinked, stunned. "But I..." Crack. The gavel fell again, sharp and brutal. "That's 30 days in county lockup." Whitaker snapped. "Maybe that'll teach you how to respect a courtroom." Gasps filled the air. Someone in the gallery muttered, "You've got to be kidding." David's lawyer raised his hand to object, but the judge waved him off. The room froze in disbelief. No warning, no explanation, just a young black man punished with jail time for trying to speak. Whitaker scribbled something in his notes, utterly unfazed. In the back row, Traoré slowly rose from his seat. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't make a sound. He simply stood, eyes locked on the bench. Whitaker didn't look up, but he felt it. Every muscle in his body tensed. Traoré didn't speak. He didn't have to. The weight of his presence alone was louder than any objection. He turned, walked silently down the aisle, and exited the room with steady, deliberate steps. The door clicked shut behind him. But inside his coat, Malikika was already texting a single line to their media contact. Whitaker just gave 30 days for speaking. Traoré was there. We have witnesses. The spark had landed. The fuse was lit. And Judge Whitaker didn't even realize the explosion had already begun. By the next morning, the sidewalk in front of the George L. Allen courthouse had transformed into something no one could have predicted just a week earlier. What was once a cold slab of concrete surrounded by parking meters and silence had turned into a living, breathing protest stage. The crowd wasn't enormous. Not yet. But it was electric. College students, local pastors, mothers with strollers, off-duty public defenders, and even elderly churchgoers had gathered with hand-painted signs that told the story louder than any speech. The bench is not a throne. Contempt is not a weapon. We see you, Ibrahim. Someone brought a hand drum, and within minutes, a steady rhythm echoed down the block. Chants rose in tempo and volume. We see you. Then, justice, not ego. A group of teens turned an old protest call into a parody chant that got half the crowd laughing. This court needs a timeout, not another takedown. Laughter rippled through the line of demonstrators, but there was nothing unserious about their presence. News crews started arriving, first the local affiliates, then the national outlets. Some reporters were skeptical at first. After all, it had started with a parking ticket. But the more they read, the more they listened, the more it became clear something real was happening. What began as a single man standing up in court had cracked open a doorway that thousands had been waiting to walk through. And while the mood outside was fueled by humor and homemade signs, there was a deep, coiled tension underneath. This wasn't just a protest. This was a warning. The public had stopped whispering, and now they were singing. Inside the courthouse, however, the mood was entirely different. The tension wasn't celebratory. It was suffocating. Judge Whitaker had arrived that morning through the underground entrance, bypassing the front doors for the first time in years. The murmurs of protest had reached his ears. The headlines had reached his desk. And though he tried to maintain his usual iron demeanor, something in him had cracked. The courtroom had a fresh layer of uniformed security standing by the walls, more officers than usual, eyes constantly scanning. Cameras were barred from the room, but the judge knew the court of public opinion had already taken its seat. He stormed in, robe flapping, and slammed the gavel down without waiting for silence. This bench, he barked, voice trembling slightly, is not a prop for political theater. His eyes darted across the room, searching for any sign of defiance. This courtroom is not a stage for activism. Anyone who forgets that will be removed and sanctioned immediately. But no one spoke. No one moved. That stillness, the kind he once controlled with authority, now belonged to something else, a fear he couldn't command because it came from within. A clerk shuffled papers a little too loudly. He snapped, "Quiet." A lawyer coughed into her sleeve. He glared at her for 5 full seconds. He tried to rule as he always had, with force, with speed, with disdain. But something had shifted. The public defenders raised objections a little more boldly now. A few jurors looked up when he spoke, not down. And every time he glanced toward the back of the room, his eyes flicked instinctively to the empty seat where Traoré had sat 2 days before. It was vacant now, but the weight of it still lingered like a shadow carved into the bench itself. Whitaker slammed his gavel again. "This is my courtroom," he declared. But this time, the words didn't echo. They sounded smaller, shrinking, because somewhere, beneath the marble, behind the walls, through the glass, in steel and formality, the system had begun to tremble. The man who used to rule without question now found himself ruling under watch. And that truth, silent and suffocating, had never felt heavier. The chamber was colder than the courtroom had ever been. Not because of temperature, but because of atmosphere. This was not Whitaker's domain anymore. This was the disciplinary hearing, public, televised, recorded in full, and the judge who had once roared from behind his bench now sat at the defendant's table, flanked by 2 sharp-suited attorneys and stripped of his black robe. The walls were bare. The panel sat high above him, silent and impassive, as one by one, the witnesses came forward. A former clerk, voice shaking, recalled being told to toss out anything emotional in family letters submitted before sentencing. "They just want to make us feel bad," Whitaker had reportedly said. A public defender testified to a pattern of contempt charges filed minutes after hearings began, used to stifle defendants from asking even basic questions. Her voice was clipped, precise. No theatrics, just patterns, dates, and cold facts. Then came the defendants themselves, a young man who'd spent 30 days in jail for saying, "Sir," too loudly, a Latina mother who had been silenced mid-testimony during a custody plea because the judge deemed her too emotional, and one woman, maybe 25, who simply stood and said, "I've never been the same since I left this courtroom. I came in asking for help. I left in handcuffs." Whitaker sat with a straight spine, lips tight, hands clasped, but his forehead glistened. He didn't speak, didn't interrupt, didn't object. But the beads of sweat running down his temple betrayed the weight of what was happening. For the first time in decades, it was his conduct on trial. And the silence that once protected him now turned into evidence. When Ibrahim Traoré entered the hearing room, there was no announcement, no trumpet of titles or reminder of rank. He walked in like every other witness, calm, steady, deliberate. He took the oath, placed a single sheet of paper on the table in front of him, and didn't look at it once. The room leaned in. Cameras clicked in rapid-fire bursts, but he didn't flinch. He spoke in a low, clear voice that carried across the room, not with volume, but with weight. "This is not about one man's rudeness," he began. "This is not about me, or a parking ticket, or a $500 fine. This is about how we treat the powerless when no one's watching. And what happens when those with robes and gavels forget that justice is not a performance. It's a responsibility." He paused only once, not for drama, but to let the silence speak. He told them about the boy behind the glass, about Naomi Taylor and the shredded letters, about the whisper from inside that said, "You're not wrong. I have the records." He didn't cry, but others did. One of the panel members dabbed their eyes with a tissue. A journalist near the front lowered his camera and simply stared. "I came here believing in the law," Traoré said. "I still do. But I have learned that believing in the law is not enough. We must also believe in accountability, especially when it's uncomfortable, especially when it comes for those who were once untouchable." He looked directly at Whitaker then, not with vengeance, but with clarity. Because if this can happen in Dallas, it can happen anywhere. And if no one speaks, it will happen again. Whitaker's eyes dropped slowly, deliberately. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence spoke volumes. For a man who had spent a lifetime commanding others to stand, he now sat, small, subdued, and utterly alone. The gavel wasn't in his hand anymore.